In the autumn of 1986, the children of Fairfax County, Virginia, rode to school in yellow buses driven by men and women who had passed background checks, fingerprinting, and multiple interviews with the county's transportation department. Among these drivers was a 43-year-old man named Robert Lipka, who had moved to the area 3 years earlier with his wife Patricia and their 2 young daughters. He lived in a modest split-level home on a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors knew him as Bob Polite, reserved, punctual. Every weekday morning at 6:45, he would emerge from his garage in his county-issued blue windbreaker, climb into bus number 247, and begin his route through the subdivisions of Northern Virginia. The children liked him well enough. He never raised his voice, never deviated from his schedule, and kept the radio tuned to the local easy-listening station. Parents waving from driveways saw exactly what they expected to see: an unremarkable middle-aged man performing an unremarkable job with quiet competence. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Robert Lipka had been trained by the KGB. The routine was flawless in its mundanity. Morning routes delivered children to 3 elementary schools by 8:15. Lipka would return the bus to the county depot, complete his paperwork, and then spend his afternoons performing odd jobs: landscaping, house painting, minor carpentry work that he advertised through handwritten notices on community bulletin boards. His wife worked part-time at a local grocery store. Their daughters attended the schools where other drivers delivered children. On weekends, the family could be seen at church services or shopping at the Tyson's Corner Mall. Neighbors who interacted with the Lipkas described them in terms so generic they could have applied to 10,000. American families, nice people, kept to themselves, nothing unusual. In 1986, in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, being unremarkable was the most effective form of camouflage a person could possess. The Cold War had been grinding on for 4 decades. The initial panic of the 1950s had long since calcified into institutional paranoia. The FBI maintained files. The CIA ran operations. Security clearances were checked and double-checked, but the actual experience of daily life in America had become thoroughly normalized. Soviet spies were abstractions that appeared in Tom Clancy novels, not in the driver's seat of school bus 247. But there was something, a small thing, a detail that didn't quite fit the pattern of absolute ordinariness that Robert Lipka had so carefully constructed. Every Thursday afternoon, between 2 and 3 o'clock, Lipka would drive to a shopping center parking lot approximately 8 miles from his home. He would park his personal vehicle, a brown 1982 Chevrolet Malibu, in a spot near the rear of the lot, away from the main entrance to the stores. He would sit in the car for approximately 20 minutes, occasionally glancing at a newspaper spread across his steering wheel. Then he would exit the vehicle, walk to a payphone mounted on the exterior wall of a drugstore, make a call that lasted no more than 2 minutes, return to his car, and drive home. This routine occurred with such precise regularity that it could be measured by a clock. Weather did not alter it. Holiday schedules did not interrupt it. For more than 2 years, every Thursday between 2 and 3, Robert Lipka visited that parking lot and made that phone call. No one noticed. Or rather, no one noticed until the pattern intersected with another pattern 1 being monitored 3,000 miles away in the windowless offices of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The FBI, as counterintelligence division, had been tracking anomalies in Soviet communications traffic since 1984. Electronic intercepts had revealed increased cipher transmissions between KGB handlers and unidentified assets in the Washington metropolitan area. The messages were encrypted using one-time pads, virtually unbreakable, but the pattern of transmission times and frequencies suggested the presence of at least 3 active intelligence operatives working in or near the nation's capital. Standard protocol dictated surveillance of known Soviet diplomats and suspected KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover. But these particular transmissions suggested something different. Sleeper agents, assets recruited years or even decades earlier, now activated for reasons the FBI could only theorize. The investigation, codenamed Royal Charm, involved monitoring thousands of hours of communications, tracking financial anomalies, and maintaining physical surveillance on more than 60 individuals who had triggered some minor flag in the vast security apparatus of the American intelligence community. Robert Lipka was not among those 60 individuals. His background check for the bus driver position had revealed nothing of concern. Born in Pennsylvania, high school education, honorable discharge from the Army after a 4-year enlistment in the mid-1960s, a work history of unremarkable civilian jobs, no criminal record, no foreign travel beyond a single vacation to Canada in 1979. The Fairfax County school system had hired him without hesitation. He was exactly what they needed: reliable, responsible, unremarkable. But in March 1988, a defector arrived. His name was Vasily Mitrokhin, and he had spent 30 years working in the archives of the KGB's first chief directorate, the branch responsible for foreign intelligence operations. When he walked into the British embassy in Riga carrying 6 notebooks filled with handwritten details of KGB operations spanning 4 decades, Western intelligence agencies gained access to one of the most comprehensive breaches in the history of Cold War espionage. Mitrokhin had not stolen documents that would have been impossible given the security protocols, but he had methodically copied names, dates, operational details, and agent codenames into notebooks that he smuggled out page by page over the course of years. The information was staggering in its scope. Hundreds of operations, thousands of names. Sleeper agents in Western governments, military installations, research facilities, and infrastructure positions who had been recruited during the 1960s and 1970s and then gone dormant, waiting for activation. Among the thousands of entries, one caught the attention of FBI analysts reviewing the American section of Mitrokhin's archive. The notation read, KIEV Robert, Army Security Agency, early assignment, recruited 1965, handler Sharaponov, exfiltration 1967, reactivated 1984, current location, Virginia suburbs, low priority asset, document courier function. The codename was KIEV. The handler was identified as Colonel Vladimir Cherepanov, a KGB officer who had operated in the United States under diplomatic cover during the 1960s. The timeline matched a specific window when the Soviet Union had aggressively targeted young American military personnel with access to classified communications. And the location Virginia suburbs was precisely where Royal Charm had detected unexplained communications patterns. The FBI began the methodical process of identification. Robert Lipka had served in the Army Security Agency from 1964 to 1967. The ASA was responsible for signals intelligence intercepting and decrypting communications from adversarial nations. Personnel with ASA clearances had access to some of the most sensitive information in the American military infrastructure: Soviet communications protocols, encryption methods, strategic military planning documents, and NATO intelligence sharing arrangements. A compromised ASA specialist could provide the KGB with information that would take decades to fully assess and counteract. During the mid-1960s, ASA facilities at Fort Meade, Maryland, and other locations had processed vast quantities of intercepted Soviet communications. Young enlisted men, many barely out of their teenage years, sat in climate-controlled rooms wearing headphones, transcribing Russian conversations, typing intercepts into reports that moved up the classification chain. The work was tedious, demanding, and absolutely critical to American signals intelligence operations. Robert Lipka had been one of those young men. In 1965, at the age of 22, specialist Robert Lipka had been assigned to the ASA facility at Fort Meade. His security clearance had been granted after standard background investigations revealed nothing of concern. He was the son of a Pennsylvania steelworker, had graduated high school with unremarkable grades, and had enlisted in the Army with the vague intention of learning a useful skill that might translate into civilian employment after his service ended. The ASA had trained him in basic Russian language skills and cryptographic procedures. His work involved processing intercepts and maintaining records of Soviet communications traffic. He had no ideology that anyone could detect, no obvious vulnerabilities, no signs of discontent. He was, in every measurable way, exactly the kind of young man the Army trusted with its secrets. What his superiors did not know was that Robert Lipka had been approached. The approach had occurred in Washington, D.C., during a weekend leave in the spring of 1965. Lipka had been walking near DuPont Circle when a man middle-aged, well-dressed, speaking English with a barely detectable accent, had struck up a conversation about nothing in particular: the weather, the city, the experience of military service. The conversation had seemed entirely random, entirely forgettable. But 3 weeks later, the same man had appeared again, this time at a coffee shop that Lipka frequented. Another casual conversation. This time, the man had mentioned that he represented a European research organization interested in American perspectives on international relations. Would Lipka be interested in participating in an occasional discussion group? There would be a small honorarium for his time, $50 per session. For a young enlisted man earning less than $300 per month, $50 was significant. Lipka had agreed. The meetings had started with innocuous conversations. Lipka's opinions on politics, his views on the Soviet Union, his assessment of American military readiness. Nothing classified was discussed. Nothing illegal was requested. But gradually, over months, the nature of the conversations had shifted. The man, who eventually identified himself as Victor, had begun asking more specific questions. What was the structure of the ASA? What kind of documents did Lipka handle? Were security protocols strict or lax? And then, carefully, delicately, Victor had floated a proposal. If Lipka could provide certain documents, nothing critical, just examples of bureaucratic paperwork, organizational charts, nothing that would endanger anyone, the compensation would increase substantially. $500 per document, perhaps more, depending on the value. Robert Lipka had said yes. The reasons why a young American soldier chooses to betray his country are rarely simple. Ideology played almost no role in Lipka's decision. He had no particular affection for communism, no grievance against American democracy, no grand political vision that justified treason. What he had was financial pressure, a girlfriend who wanted things he could not afford, a future that seemed economically precarious, and an opportunity that seemed, in the moment, victimless. The documents he provided were, he told himself, minor: organizational charts, administrative procedures. Nothing that would get anyone killed. Victor had assured him of this repeatedly. The information was for research purposes only. No harm would come from it. This is how the KGB operated. Not through dramatic recruitment of committed ideologues, but through the patient exploitation of ordinary human weakness: debt, ego, resentment, ambition, fear. They identified vulnerabilities and then applied pressure so gradually that the target never experienced the moral whiplash of a single catastrophic decision. Instead, Robert Lipka had made a series of small decisions, each one slightly more compromising than the last, until he was deeply entangled in a relationship he could no longer escape. By 1966, Lipka was providing the KGB with classified signals intelligence documents. The material he passed included intercepts of Soviet military communications, encryption keys, analytical reports assessing Soviet strategic capabilities, and technical documentation of American cryptographic procedures. He would remove documents from secure areas by hiding them in his uniform. photograph them at home using a Minix camera provided by Victor, and return the originals before they were missed. The Dead Drops carefully choreographed exchanges where Lipka would leave film canisters in prearranged locations to be retrieved by KGB couriers occurred in parks and shopping centers around Washington, D.C. The compensation increased to thousands of dollars per delivery. Lipka purchased a new car. He took his girlfriend on trips. He began to live at a level slightly above what his military salary should have afforded, but not so far above as to trigger suspicion. For 2 years, the operation continued without interruption. In 1967, Robert Lipka's enlistment ended. He received an honorable discharge and returned to civilian life. Victor made contact one final time in a meeting at a restaurant in Philadelphia. The KGB, Victor explained, was satisfied with Lipka's service. He would be paid $10,000 as a final settlement. He should live a normal life, maintain a low profile, and avoid any activity that might draw attention. If circumstances changed, if the KGB ever needed his assistance again, they would find a way to contact him. Until then, he was to disappear into the landscape of ordinary American life, and Robert Lipka did exactly that. For 17 years, Robert Lipka lived a life of absolute normalcy. He moved from Pennsylvania to Virginia. He married. He had children. He worked a series of unremarkable jobs: warehouse work, delivery driving, maintenance positions that required no background investigations beyond basic criminal checks. He paid his taxes. He attended parent-teacher conferences. He drove a school bus. The $10,000 from the KGB had been spent long ago. The Minix camera had been disassembled and discarded. The memory of Victor had faded into something distant and unreal, like a fever dream from another lifetime. Lipka never spoke of what he had done, not to his wife, not to anyone. The secret remained sealed away in a compartment of his mind that he rarely opened. But the KGB does not forget its assets. In 1984, during a period of escalating tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the KGB initiated a program to reactivate dormant agents who had been recruited decades earlier. The strategic calculus was straightforward. Sleeper agents who had gone undetected for 15 or 20 years were unlikely to be under surveillance. They had successfully integrated into American society. They could be used for low-risk operations document transfers, communications relays, surveillance support that did not require them to have current access to classified information. Robert Lipka, now 41 years old and driving a school bus in Northern Virginia, received a phone call at his home one evening in October 1984. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, but the words were not. "Victor asked me to tell you that he remembers your conversations about European research." The phrase was a recognition code, something Lipka had not heard in 17 years. His first instinct was to hang up. His second instinct was to panic. But the voice continued, calm and professional. "There is no danger. We only need a small favor. Someone will meet you Thursday afternoon. You will know the location." The call ended. Lipka stood in his kitchen, the receiver still in his hand, feeling the carefully constructed normalcy of his life beginning to crack. He had desperately wanted to believe that his past was truly past, that the thing he had done in his 20s would remain buried forever. But the KGB operated on different timelines. 17 years was nothing. Lipka was an investment that had been allowed to mature. Now it was time to collect. The meeting occurred in a parking lot. A man younger than Victor, American in appearance and speech, explained the situation with bureaucratic efficiency. The KGB required occasional assistance with document transfers. Nothing Lipka would be asked to do involved accessing classified information. He would simply serve as a courier, moving packages from one location to another. The work would be infrequent, perhaps once every few months. The compensation would be modest, but regular, $500 per task. And refusal, the man explained without explicit threat, would be inadvisable. The KGB possessed documentation of Lipka's earlier activities. Exposure would result in prosecution, imprisonment, and the destruction of everything Lipka had built over the past 17 years. Robert Lipka agreed to cooperate. The reactivation was handled with meticulous professionalism. Lipka was given a phone number to call each week from a payphone, never from his home, never from the same location, twice in succession. He was instructed to use the Thursday afternoon window between his morning bus route and his wife as return from work. During these calls, which lasted no more than 2 minutes, he would receive coded instructions, a date, a location, a description of a package. He would retrieve the package, usually a small envelope or box, hidden in a dead-drop location, and deliver it to a second location, where it would be collected by another courier in the chain. Lipka never knew what the packages contained. He did not ask. Plausible deniability was a protection for everyone involved. For 4 years, this routine continued. Lipka made his Thursday phone calls. He collected his packages. He received his payments in cash, delivered in plain envelopes, left in dead drops separate from the document transfers. The amounts were modest enough not to create unexplained wealth, but sufficient to provide small comforts, nicer vacations, better appliances, a college fund for his daughters. His wife Patricia noticed the slight improvement in their financial situation, but attributed it to her husband's odd jobs and careful budgeting. The school system never had cause to question him, and neighbors never suspected anything unusual. Robert Lipka had become exactly what the KGB needed, an invisible conduit embedded in the infrastructure of ordinary American life. But across the Potomac River, in the offices of the FBI's Washington field office, patterns were being analyzed. The Royal Charm investigation had identified multiple communications anomalies consistent with active espionage operations. Surveillance teams were tracking suspected KGB officers. Financial analysts were searching for unexplained cash flows. And when Vasily Mitrokhin's archive arrived in 1988, FBI counterintelligence gained a critical piece of the puzzle: a list of American citizens who had been recruited by the KGB during the 1960s and 1970s. The list included code names, recruitment dates, and operational details. Some of the individuals named had already been identified and prosecuted. Others had died. But several remained unidentified names, redacted or missing from Mitrokhin's notes, but with enough contextual details to allow reconstruction. The entry for KIEV provided several key facts. Army Security Agency, recruited 1965, Handler Cherepanov. Exfiltration 1967, reactivated 1984, Virginia suburbs. FBI analysts began constructing a profile. The individual would now be in his mid-40s. He would have served in the ASA between 1964 and 1967. He would have received an honorable discharge. He would be living in the Virginia suburbs Fairfax, Arlington, or Prince William County. And he would have been dormant for 17 years before reactivation in 1984. The FBI pulled military records for every individual who had served in the Army Security Agency at Fort Meade between 1964 and 1967, and who had received an honorable discharge in 1967. The list contained several hundred names. They cross-referenced against current addresses in Northern Virginia. The list narrowed to 43 individuals. They looked for financial patterns, employment histories, any indicator that might correlate with a reactivated sleeper agent. And they found Robert Lipka. His profile matched every parameter. ASA service from 1964 to 1967. Honorable discharge in 1967. Currently residing in Fairfax County. Employment in a position that required minimal background investigation. And this was the detail that elevated him to primary suspect status. a pattern of Thursday afternoon absences that corresponded precisely with the communications windows identified in Royal Charm intercepts. In August 1988, the FBI initiated surveillance. Special agents established observation posts near Lipka's home and along his bus route. They monitored his Thursday afternoon routine. They photographed him making his phone calls from the parking lot payphone. They followed him on days when he collected packages from dead drop locations, a hollowed-out section of a fallen tree in a park, a magnetic container hidden beneath a park bench, a plastic bag taped inside a drainage pipe. They documented everything with the exhaustive precision that counterintelligence operations demand. But documentation was not enough for prosecution. The FBI needed evidence of actual espionage, the transfer of classified information, or communication with a foreign intelligence service. What they had was circumstantial behavior that could potentially be explained as innocent, though increasingly implausible, activity. The decision was made to attempt a provocation operation. In February 1993, nearly 5 years after initial surveillance began, the FBI created a false flag scenario designed to force Lipka into a compromising action. An undercover FBI agent, posing as a Russian intelligence officer, made contact with Lipka using the recognition codes that had been extracted from debriefings of other Soviet defectors. The agent, speaking with a convincing Russian accent and demonstrating knowledge of Lipka's past activities, requested a meeting to discuss urgent matters of mutual interest. Lipka, believing he was meeting with a genuine KGB representative, agreed. The meeting occurred in a hotel room in Alexandria, Virginia. FBI recording equipment captured every word. The undercover agent explained that the KGB, now technically the SVR, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, needed Lipka's assistance with a sensitive document transfer. The collapse of the USSR had disrupted traditional intelligence networks, and reliable assets like Lipka were more valuable than ever. Would he be willing to help? The compensation would be substantial, $10,000 for a single operation. Lipka hesitated. The collapse of the Soviet Union had occurred 2 years earlier. The Cold War, for all practical purposes, was over. But the habits of deception and the fear of exposure remained. If he refused, would they expose him? Would his decades-old crimes finally surface? And if he cooperated one final time, perhaps this would truly be the end. He agreed. Over the next several weeks, Lipka met with the undercover agent multiple times. He accepted packages. He discussed his past activities in the Army Security Agency, providing details that confirmed his identity as the Agent K.I.E.V. He described his recruitment by Victor, his dead drop procedures, his 17-year dormancy, and his reactivation in 1984. Every statement was recorded. Every meeting was documented. The FBI assembled a prosecutorial case that was, by the standards of espionage investigations, nearly airtight. On May 18, 1993, FBI agents arrested Robert Lipka at his home in Fairfax County. The arrest occurred at dawn. Special agents surrounded the split-level house on the quiet cul-de-sac. Neighbors, waking to prepare for work, saw men in FBI windbreakers leading Robert Lipka still in his pajamas, hands cuffed behind his back to a waiting vehicle. Patricia Lipka stood in the doorway, her face a mask of incomprehension. Her daughters, now teenagers, watched from upstairs windows as their father disappeared into the car. Within hours, the story dominated local news broadcasts. School bus driver arrested on espionage charges. The children of Fairfax County, who had ridden bus 247 for years, learned that their quiet, unremarkable driver had once betrayed his country to the Soviet Union. The FBI's search of Lipka's home revealed meticulous evidence of compartmentalized deception. In a locked filing cabinet in the basement, agents found documents related to his odd jobs and bus driving work ordinary records of an ordinary life. But hidden inside a hollowed-out section of wall insulation, They discovered a metal box containing $19,000 in cash, rubber-banded in stacks of $100 bills, along with a handwritten ledger documenting payments received since 1984. There were no classified documents, no spy equipment, no smoking gun that definitively proved ongoing espionage beyond the circumstantial evidence and Lipka's own recorded statements to the undercover FBI agent. But that was sufficient. The federal indictment charged Robert Lipka with conspiracy to commit espionage, a charge that carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment. During the initial interrogation, Lipka maintained silence on the advice of his court-appointed attorney. But as the prosecution assembled its case testimony from Michoacan archive analysts, surveillance footage, audio recordings from the undercover operation, testimony from former Army colleagues who recalled Lipka's access to classified materials, the futility of denial became apparent. In December 1993, facing overwhelming evidence, Robert Lipka accepted a plea agreement. He would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage in exchange for a recommended sentence of 18 years in federal prison. In his allocution before the court, he read a brief prepared statement acknowledging his actions during the 1960s and his reactivation in the 1980s. He expressed remorse. He claimed that ideology had played no role in his decisions, that he had been motivated by financial need and youthful foolishness. He asked the court for mercy, citing his 2 decades of otherwise law-abiding civilian life. The judge sentenced him to 18 years and 4 months in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Patricia Lipka filed for divorce 3 months later. In court documents, she stated that she had been unaware of her husband's espionage activities, and that the betrayal of trust rendered the marriage irreparable. She petitioned for a legal name change for herself and her daughters, seeking to distance them from the infamy now attached to the Lipka surname. Neighbors who had known the family described Patricia as devastated a woman who had believed she was married to a school bus driver and odd job handyman, only to discover that her entire marriage had been constructed atop a foundation of lies. She had shared a bed for 20 years with a man who had kept the most significant fact about himself hidden in a sealed compartment she never knew existed. The damage assessment conducted by military intelligence and the FBI attempted to calculate the harm caused by Lipka's espionage. The documents he had provided to the KGB in the 1960s included signals intelligence that revealed American cryptographic capabilities, intercept procedures, and analytical methods. Soviet intelligence had used this information to modify their communications protocols, rendering certain American collection efforts less effective and potentially compromising ongoing operations. The exact number of intelligence sources or methods compromised could never be fully calculated. The ripple effects of a single breach can propagate for decades, but analysts estimated that Lipka's betrayal had set back American signals intelligence operations by several years and had potentially exposed NATO allies' communications to Soviet interception. Whether anyone had died as a direct result of Lipka's actions remained unclear, but the possibility could not be ruled out. His daughters, interviewed years later by journalists, described the experience of learning their father's true identity as a kind of ontological fracture. The man who had driven them to soccer practice, who had helped with homework, who had attended school plays and Christmas pageants, was simultaneously a traitor who had sold American secrets to the Soviet Union. How does one reconcile those two realities? He was both their father and a stranger. They had loved a person who turned out to be, in some fundamental sense, a performance. The girls, now grown women with families of their own, had changed their names, moved to different states, and severed all contact with Robert Lipka. When asked if they had forgiven him, one daughter responded, "I don't know if forgiveness is even the right concept. It's not that I'm angry anymore. It's that I don't know who I would be forgiving. The man I thought was my father never actually existed." Robert Lipka served 15 years before being released on supervised parole in 2008. He was 65 years old, in declining health, and unemployable. The world he emerged into bore almost no resemblance to the world he had known in 1993. The Soviet Union had been gone for 17 years. The Cold War was a historical artifact studied in high school textbooks. The urgency and paranoia that had defined his espionage had evaporated, leaving only the residue of personal devastation. He lived alone in a subsidized apartment in Pennsylvania, estranged from his former family, monitored by federal parole officers, and largely forgotten except by historians researching Cold War espionage cases. In 2013, a journalist located Lipka and requested an interview. The resulting article described a man consumed by regret, but also oddly detached from the magnitude of his crimes. Lipka insisted that he had never intended to harm anyone, that the documents he provided had seemed innocuous at the time, that he had been young and stupid and manipulated by professionals who knew exactly how to exploit his weaknesses. He claimed that the reactivation in 1984 had been coerced, that he had cooperated out of fear rather than conviction. But when pressed about the cash found in his home, $19,000 accumulated over 9 years of courier work, Lipka offered no explanation beyond a shrug. The money had been there. He had taken it. It had seemed, at the time, like compensation for minimal risk. The journalist asked if Lipka had ever contacted his daughters. He said he had written letters, all returned unopened. Did he understand why they refused contact? Yes, he said. He understood. Did he believe they would ever forgive him? A long pause. Then, I don't think I've forgiven myself, so I can't expect them to. Robert Lipka died in 2015 at the age of 72. The obituary in his local newspaper made no mention of his espionage conviction. It identified him simply as a former Army veteran and school bus driver, survived by 2 daughters, whose names were not listed. The case of Robert Lipka contains no clear moral lesson, no tidy conclusion about heroism or villainy. He was not a committed ideologue who betrayed his country for political conviction. He was not a tragic figure coerced by circumstances beyond his control. He was an ordinary man who made a catastrophic choice in his early 20s, compounded by subsequent choices to hide, to accept reactivation, to continue the deception for decades. The harm he caused rippled outward in ways that can never be fully measured. Intelligence operations compromised, adversaries empowered, and families destroyed. His wife lost the marriage she believed she had. His daughters lost the father they thought they knew. And Lipka himself lost everything that might have constituted a meaningful life. The Cold War produced thousands of Robert Lipka's individuals on both sides who became instruments of larger forces, who traded loyalty for cash or ideology or fear, who believed they could compartmentalize betrayal and continue living normal lives. The machinery of espionage depends on such people, not the glamorous spies of fiction, but the mundane functionaries who handle documents, make phone calls, and drive packages from one dead drop to another. They are the invisible infrastructure of intelligence warfare, and their ordinariness is precisely what makes them effective. For 29 years, Robert Lipka drove through the suburbs of Northern Virginia in a yellow school bus, transporting children who had no idea that the man behind the wheel had once photographed classified documents in the darkness of his apartment and delivered them to Soviet intelligence officers. He waved to parents. He followed his routes with punctuality. He lived a performance of normalcy so convincing that even those closest to him never suspected the compartment of secrets he carried. And when the machinery of counterintelligence finally caught up with him, when the patient work of analysts and surveillance teams and defectors' notebooks converged on his name, the revelation was not dramatic. It was simply the exposure of a truth that had existed all along, hidden in plain sight behind the facade of an unremarkable life. In the end, Robert Lipka was caught not because he made a spectacular mistake, but because espionage is a system of interconnected vulnerabilities, and systems eventually fail. A defector writes down a name. An analyst notices a pattern. A surveillance team documents a phone call. The threads converge, slowly but inexorably, until the hidden becomes visible and the secret becomes known. The children who rode bus 247 are adults now, many with children of their own. Some remember the news coverage from 1993, the shock of learning that their bus driver had been a spy. Others have forgotten entirely, the memory subsumed into the general background of childhood experience. But for those who do remember, there remains an unsettling question. If the person entrusted with your safety, who seemed so utterly normal, could be harboring such profound deception, who else might be performing a similar masquerade? The Cold War may have ended, but the fundamental uncertainty it revealed, the knowledge that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary betrayal, persists as its most enduring legacy. Robert Lipka drove a school bus in Fairfax County, Virginia. He was also an agent of the KGB. These two facts coexisted for years without contradiction, because espionage, at its core, is not about drama or danger. It is about the patient construction of deniability, the meticulous performance of normalcy, and the willingness to live within a lie so complete that even those sleeping beside you never glimpse the truth. Until, one morning, the FBI arrives at dawn, and the compartments collapse, and everything hidden becomes suddenly, irrevocably visible.